Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're continuing on in Unit 4, talking about political organizations of space. And so for the last several videos we've been talking a lot about borders and boundaries and the way that states establish those borders and boundaries, some different definitions and things. And so today we're going to move on to a little bit more complicated subject, talking about oceanic boundaries. So you can imagine some of the difficulty that we might run into if we're dealing with states that have borders that go along the coastline, especially when it comes to claiming waters, when it comes to claiming the rights of exploration, when it comes to navigable waters and allowing ships to go through navigation lanes and things like that. And of course, as the world has become much more globalized and trade networks across the world have been established, this is something that has become increasingly important. And so the United Nations set up a set of laws called the Convention on the Law of the Seas that deals with, or tries to deal with, this particular situation. Now, of course, there's always the issue with the United Nations. You really have to take into consideration that not all states are always going to follow all the laws or the rules that are set down by the United Nations. And even if it's put before the United Nations, states don't necessarily always have to sign on to it. But of course, it's a step in the right direction, because we're trying to create a situation where states are working with each other to establish good trade relationships. And of course, good trade relationships really are good for everybody, because they stimulate income in the country where the goods are being exported. They allow for the flow of cheap goods to come into another country. And so, of course, these things are positive. And one of the important elements maybe of this that you might consider is the way that allows some of the smaller countries, maybe the countries that aren't as powerful, to claim rights of resources that are right off of their coastline, and to keep some of the other larger countries from dominating them with maybe a very powerful navy or something like that. So obviously the attempt at this is good, but it doesn't always work out, as we'll see as you'll see in some of the situations, especially that are taking place right now in the South China Sea, as China is trying to assert its dominance over countries in East Asia. So anyway, so these are the basic principles of how it is that states are going to establish boundaries and borders in the ocean. And of course, really the most difficult thing historically has been, how exactly do you determine where a state's boundary begins and ends in regards to the ocean? So of course, the new technologies and satellites and things like that, it's much easier for ships to figure out where exactly they are, whether they're crossing over into territorial waters. But of course, prior to that, it would have been very difficult. And so as time progresses and as technology improves, understanding these borders and boundaries is going to become a little bit easier. So just some of the basic premise of the laws are that coastal states all have the right to a certain amount of territory off of their coast that they can consider a part of their territorial waters. Now, what we mean by territorial waters is that it is an extension of the sovereign state itself. So it's almost just like being, well, not almost, but it is just like being inside the country itself. And so it kind of creates this water buffer for a state and extends out into the ocean. So of course, this allows for the laws, the sovereignty, the rights of that state to extend out into the ocean. And of course, this is good, especially in terms of military action and keeping other states at bay when they might have their military vessels out in the sea and things along those lines. Now, this territorial water extends out 12 nautical miles, but we'll see the graphic down here. This comes from the United Nations website. It looks like there's some extenuating circumstances where they'll allow for the extension of that particular area, just depending on what kind of neighbors are around, how close they are, those types of things. Now, of course, outside of that 12 nautical miles, and even sometimes within that 12 nautical miles, ships, especially trading ships and things like that, are able to make passes and things along those lines. A couple things to point out, and we'll look at this in just a second. You'll notice this area called the exclusive economic zone. What that means is that it's not necessarily territorial water, meaning that it's a part of the country and the state's sovereignty, but that particular state holds the exclusive rights to explore that territory, explore that that region and that area for natural resources, for fishing and things along those lines. Of course, they're able to rent it out or to allow other countries and vessels and things like that to come in if they would like. I'm sure for a fee or paying taxes or something along those lines. Maybe an interesting thing to think about right here, it says the area common heritage of mankind. Important concept by the United Nations, almost this idea that international waters are something that belong to all people, and so this idea that no one country is able to take control of those international waters, and so trying to keep certain countries from establishing their dominance and asserting themselves, especially to keep the flow of trade and the flow of goods open between all states across the world. Now, with those coastal states, and this was was mentioning earlier, is that beyond the 12 nautical miles, there's a 200 nautical, what they call exclusive economic zone, that's going to extend out from the state. And again, I guess I'm just repeating myself. You have a situation where that's going to be for the state exclusively to exploit and explore. Now, again, even within those 200 nautical miles, other ships can pass and things like that, and you're not infringing upon the state's sovereignty or territory. But of course, if you're going to try to explore for resources or take resources, then you'd have to deal with that state and its policies and things along those lines. Now, I've been mentioning this several times, and of course we looked at it earlier. But the issue with China, you can see the situation where even though the United Nations might have these laws out, states might sign on to it. Not all states are necessarily going to follow that, because you can see the different lines here. China is saying that its territorial waters extend all the way around this red line, and of course you can see how that's going to cause an issue. I mean, essentially it comes up into Malaysia, Brunei, parts of Indonesia, and the Philippines. And so that's crowding them, and you see the Philippines, their blue line, the area that they have claimed is theirs. And then you can see the smaller blue line. This is part of the United Nations understanding of how laws in the sea should work. So the problem with the United Nations is always that it's really up to the states to decide for themselves how they're going to follow the laws, if they're going to follow the laws, things like that. Of course, it's great if all the states get along, but when you have an issue like this where China has really has risen up economically, has risen up militarily, and they're kind of trying to assert some authority and dominance in the region, this creates additional issues. And so you can see the difference between what the Chinese feel like is theirs and then what everybody else feels like belongs to them. Now, if you have a situation where there are not 200 nautical miles, and I think this this is a good example of that. You see the border between Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. A situation where there's not 200 nautical miles between states, the states are supposed to evenly divide up the water, the territory, as much as possible using what's called the median line principle. Essentially, you even it out based upon where the borders, the boundaries of the country are, and you try to give everybody equal access to the resources extending out from their coastline. And again, I think you see that with Brunei. Brunei is not a very large country. You can see how the border extends directly out from its coastline. Same thing with this portion of Indonesia over here, and same thing with Malaysia. So it extends out directly from its coastline, trying to give everybody equal access to the resources and the water, as is, I guess, congruent with the size of their country. And so again, these are the rules and the principles and laws that the United Nations has put down to try and create a uniform code for establishing the borders and the boundaries within the ocean. That's all we got. That's all that we have for this time. I hope that you'll join us again when we come back next time and we talk about boundary disputes and the different types of boundary disputes. And you can imagine, we could talk about a boundary dispute right here, and we'll talk specifically about what type of boundary dispute that is. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.